Chairperson of Shrewsbury School Committee. Welcome to our meeting of February 24th. Tonight's meeting is broadcast live on Selco channels 29 and 329 and streamed live on Shrewsbury Media Connections website. I'd like to thank SMC Executive Director Mark Serra, as well as Shrewsbury Public Schools IT Director Brian LaRue, who help with all of our meetings. First on the agenda is public participation. No one has asked to address the committee this evening, but if anybody wishes to do so, please contact us at schoolcommittee@shrewsbury.k12.ma.us. First is Chairperson and Members Report. Does anybody have anything? Mr. Wensky?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I'd just like to thank the members of the Coolidge Elementary School PTO. Jason and I had the opportunity to meet with them last night to talk about our budget challenges. It's a very engaged group. Appreciate the time that they allowed us. This is essentially meeting 1 of 10 with our PTOs over the next month. So looking forward to our scheduled meetings next week.
Thank you. Anything further? No? Next is Superintendent's Report.
Thank you, Ms. Fritz. Throughout the pandemic and the shift to doing things more remotely, we continue to have ways in which our staff and students are doing things in innovative ways to maintain different traditions that we've had. I want to reach out and thank a variety of groups who've been doing excellent work. First off, I want to thank the students and educators at the high school for their recent science fair. I'll send out via email blast the names of those who earned distinction and won prizes. But there was entirely virtual fair this year with their projects online, and we thank all the judges who participated as well in an online manner. And congratulate all those for participating. There's some outstanding projects. Similarly, I wanted to congratulate our speech and debate team members who qualified for nationals. They continue to do all of their tournaments online, continue to meet with great levels of success. And again, I'll let people know who those students are when we send out an update. But the speech and debate program continues to thrive despite the shift to doing things remotely. Also, our robotics team recently performed some community service by sponsoring a virtual blood drive. Pleased and proud that even though they can't do their work in person and they've been incredibly community service minded, it's part of the reason they've won the Chairman's Award multiple times over the last several years. Was an excellent way to do something for the community that didn't require to be in person. And I also want to thank our art educators and all of our student artists. There's an online art show that's been put up. We'll make sure that that link gets out as well. And so not being able to have our traditional art shows in person, but again, students continue to create some wonderful pieces, and we can share those virtually with the community. So thank you to all of those groups. Finally, as far as a group that did something differently, and I'm looking forward to seeing this. I believe the next second cohort, or the cohort C students will see this tomorrow, but February being Black History Month, our high school Black History Committee has once again, it's one of the most highlights of the year when they put on their annual Black History Month assembly. They've created something online in a virtual way, and looking forward to see what they've produced. It's obviously this year in particular, we expect that to be particularly impactful. So congratulations to the students and to the staff advisors for the Black History Committee at Shrewsbury High School. The final piece I'd like to share is that we've had multiple successful meetings of the ad hoc mascot study group to look at the Shrewsbury High School mascot. I'm really very impressed with the conversations that we're having, the research that's being done. It's like anything else, trying to do this over Zoom is you don't go as quickly as you would like. But in addition to that, and obviously you'll know from some of the upcoming reports, just the amount of bandwidth that we have as a school district right now to do that work. We are certainly going to need, in my estimation, to extend the original timeline that was established. I don't have an idea of a new timeline. I'll be reaching out to the group. Again, it's important work, but we do have other urgent and important work that needs to take priority right now relative to the variety of issues we're facing with the pandemic and the budget. So again, appreciate everyone doing that work. We will be reaching out. The next step for that committee is to reach out to gain feedback from various stakeholders about the issue. We'll certainly move that forward as soon as we can. But to do the work thoughtfully and to do the work well is going to take more time than we originally intended. So wanted to let the school committee know that. And again, thank everyone who's been participating on that committee.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Staying with Dr. Sawyer, we will continue with our school district's response to the pandemic.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity again to provide an update to the community. We'll again emphasize our key messages that our focus all along throughout the pandemic has been on the health and the well-being of our students and their families and our staff as our first priority. That we have worked to develop a safe school environment this year for everyone that prioritizes well-being and enables high levels of learning, and that we continue to operate based on guidance from public health authorities, the Mass Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, monitoring the latest data, and working, of course, and looking at what's happening with the pandemic both locally and across the state. In terms of the latest numbers, this week we've had 7 cases to date. Since Sunday, we measure our cases in calendar weeks. Since the start of school, we're up to 345 cases. We remain at 7 cases total traced to possible exposure at school. Those were in our hybrid program. We've had 1 more case in our remote program to date this week, and that's a total of 25 at this point. The update that happens daily, every weekday, to our data dashboard. You can see the case count over the last 4 weeks as of ending this past Saturday, which is encouraging trend, going from 10 to 8 cases over the last 2 full weeks. And again, people can see that directly from our main webpage if they'd like to see the data on a daily basis. This is encouraging news from the Johns Hopkins Data Center. The 7-day positivity rate for the state is now down to 1.85% as of today. That's down from 2.86%, which is from our report 2 weeks ago. You can see Massachusetts is now probably 5th or so lowest transmission rate in the country. So it continues to be encouraging news as far as the trajectory of the virus within the Commonwealth and here locally as well. As far as our data for Shrewsbury, this is based on the state's report that they publish every Thursday. And they publish that based on the 14 days up to, I think, the Saturday prior to that Thursday. So this data is a little bit older. It's obviously an encouraging trend, and hopefully we're going to see those numbers dip even more as they get closer to these last couple of weeks of data. But it had gone down to 3.73% for the 14-day rate for Shrewsbury, again, as of February 18th report, which was actually ended a bit before that. So that's a good trend as well. In terms of student and staff case ratios, you can see again it's held steady where approximately 83% of the cases are student cases and 17% are staff cases. This is within the hybrid model. Yeah, you're right. I think that this might include actually the remote model as well. This is all cases, but over 300 for students and 64 for staff. The next slide shows the distribution by school. Where you can see, obviously the schools that have larger populations are likely going to have more cases. But you can see kind of across the early childhood level to elementary to middle school, our larger schools have more cases. But I also included a slide this week, which is by grade. So this next slide, you can see across the grades, our lowest numbers remain at preschool and kindergarten. Fairly even distribution across the elementary and middle school grades, a little bit up and down, anywhere from 15 to 23 cases. High school, we know we've seen more cases among that age group, but not dramatically so on a grade-by-grade basis, in the high 20s up to a maximum of 30 in 10th grade, which is our highest grade to date. So we'll continue to track this by grade as well and provide that information in subsequent updates. This graph shows the positive cases for all students and staff on a weekly basis going back to September. So you can see the dramatic spike that happened after Thanksgiving and then again after the Christmas and New Year's holiday. Came down a bit, popped back up a little bit at the end of January, and since then has come down substantially from that point, which is mirroring, as we know, what's happening in the state and across the nation as well. As far as our public health data for Shrewsbury, again, based on last Thursday's report, for the period ending on February 6th, there were 166 cases, 11.9 per day. The positivity rate was 3.73%. We were in the yellow zone as a community. This next slide we've shared before just to remind people that we're following all the different mitigation factors that are known to reduce the risk of spread of the virus within a school setting. And we certainly are putting these things into place in a strong way, which is why we are not seeing the kind of in-school spread despite having cases in school inevitably. But those cases in school have come down as well, which is good news. As far as suspected in-school transmission, we remain at having 7 suspected cases. That represents 2% among our hybrid model cases. In other words, 98% of the cases we've seen among people in the hybrid model are not traced to anything that would have transmitted in school. We have a very good news story with our pooled surveillance testing. Prior to the February vacation week, we had 2 weeks of staff testing. 469 volunteered the first week. There were 483 the second week. We had 2 positive tests the first week, and we had 0 positive tests the second week. So that's hoping that this week, we did not test last week due to the school vacation. Staff were tested today. We'll have those results hopefully by Friday. That's what we've been getting, about a 48-hour turnaround. And we're hopeful that that remains the case, obviously, that we have no positive cases. But the idea of pooled surveillance testing is able to catch cases even before people are symptomatic and further reduce the possibility of any kind of in-school spread happening. The newest news, of course, and I referred to this in my last meeting, my last email communication with the community prior to the break. We as a leadership team have been working for some time reviewing all kinds of various options for potentially bringing more students back for more in-person learning. Obviously, right now, the case counts and the positivity rates and the lack of in-school transmission are encouraging, which leads us to believe that there are going to be more possibilities for potentially moving to more of an in-person model. At the same time, we do have significant logistical challenges that are based on the public health guidance, in particular, maintaining the distancing in classrooms and distancing for lunch. Really, I think, are chief among those. And I also want to emphasize that every school district has different circumstances. Different districts have different space available in terms of the size of their classrooms, the enrollment of their students, their class sizes essentially, in addition to funding and other resources around ways that things that might be happening. We're choosing to devote some level of funding to pooled testing, for example. Not all districts are doing that. Some districts might be spending dollars they have available through COVID money in other ways. But every district does have a set of unique circumstances, and certainly different districts are making different choices based on what they're able to do. But we have to look very carefully, of course, at what we're able to do as a school district. In addition, yesterday, and people saw this, I'm sure, in the news, the Commissioner of Education, Jeff Riley, stated that he is seeking State Board of Education approval as soon as sometime in the next couple of weeks to change some state regulations that would require school districts to return to full in-person school, starting with younger students in the elementary grades sometime in April. That was unexpected news coming from the state, and we're trying to digest what that is. We did have a conference call with the commissioner today where he described essentially what he talked about yesterday in the press conference that they gave and what he spoke to at the Board of Education meeting yesterday. We don't have specifics yet in terms of guidance from the department. They said to expect that in a couple of weeks. If we're going to return in April, obviously, we don't have the benefit of waiting very long. We need to be, and we've begun planning already, and we'll have to amp that planning up even more in order to look at what is possible and what we would have to do to comply with this kind of expectation. Obviously, the commissioner said this is contingent upon the metrics staying strong as far as case counts declining across the state. And obviously, we hope as vaccines ramp up, that will continue to, the numbers will continue to do better, which will help us in that regard. What that means for us in terms of next steps, we are going to be expanding our return to school planning work to include a wider amount of staff representation. That will, of course, include representation from our associations, the Teachers Association, the Paraprofessional Association. The association represents assistant principals. We are going to be very soon surveying our families, because one critical element of our planning is knowing whether or not families who currently have their students in the all-remote program would choose to send their child back if we went to more full in-person learning, because the commissioner did make it clear that families under the state regulations would continue to have the option of having their student be remote for the rest of the year. And how many students are actually going to be physically present in classrooms under this scenario is a critical variable in terms of what we're able to do, in terms of number of students in a classroom, and so forth. So that survey will be going out, I'm guessing, probably at the beginning of next week. And that will be important data for us to collect. And it will be, and I know that the commissioner mentioned this as well, but it will, by necessity, need to be sort of the last opportunity for families to make a decision whether or not the child will be able to come back in person, because we would not be able to accommodate kids moving back and forth, or certainly out from outside to in during the rest of the year once we're set up for additional in-person, if that is the direction that we're going to be going. And then we're going to be determining the resources we need to make the shift effectively. And certainly, you may recall when we set up this school year, the massive amount of logistics that had to happen, including removing lots of furniture from our classrooms, which are stored in multiple trailers in the high school parking lot. We would have to get some measure of furniture back into classrooms. Not easily done when we're not going to be having moving people coming into classrooms when school is in session, of course. So doing things off hours. Mr. Collins and his team will have their work cut out for them in terms of determining just all the logistical pieces and what resources we would need to bring to bear to make those things happen. The commissioner on the conference call today said he recognizes that it is not as simple as flipping a switch. I would certainly emphasize that. What could seem simple on the surface it really has many, many layers of what needs to happen. I think that universally, people would like to be back in school. Educators would like to see students back in school. Students and families would like to have students back in school. There are those who are going to remain, families we know who will remain uncomfortable, will keep their children out. But that's what I'd say, it shouldn't be, not universal, but we know that people who are comfortable having their children come to the hybrid model would like to see students back in person more. And I believe our educators would like to see that, but obviously with the emphasis on doing that in a safe way. So it's going to be critically important for us to be focusing on the well-being and balancing those risks. You know, how do we consider the health and well-being related to the possibility of contracting COVID? Those possibilities obviously are declining based on the case numbers. We don't know yet what the timing will be when educators will be able to be qualifying for the vaccine if they haven't already qualified in different ways. And we need to look at what it is that the guidance that public health and medical experts are providing us. We'll continue to reach out to the folks we've been working with to talk about what it means. And with this new expectation from the state that was just announced yesterday, we are going to do our level best to determine what's the most responsible way we could make that happen. Because obviously we're compelled to comply with state law and regulation, but we understand that we need to do this in a way that's reasonable. We need to do it in a way that's responsible. So more to come on that. We'll be working very hard on that planning, and we need to figure out what kind of resources need to be brought to bear to make it happen. So finally, again, we maintain for better hope for better times ahead, and since I've been using this slide, things have been getting better. We know that eventually we will return to a more normal kind of situation. We know that vaccine availability will be a huge factor with that as well, and comfort level for lots of folks. And we need to continue to analyze our current circumstances and make decisions using that balanced view of risk, because we know that there are negative outcomes for students when they're not in school full-time. That is something we have to take under deep consideration, look at the data about what's happening, and respond to what the medical expertise is telling us. So with that is the update I have for you this evening. I'd be happy to take any questions that the committee has.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Any questions or comments? Jason?
A comment and a question. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Sawyer, to you and your team for your continued work managing this situation. I know that the announcement from the Commonwealth yesterday caught a lot of people by surprise, and details pending, of course, might be a significant logistical undertaking to put into effect. And Dr. Sawyer, you touched on this a bit. I'm wondering if you can expand on a little bit the resource allocation requirements that may be necessary to implement something along the lines of what the commissioner talked about yesterday. A significant theme of our meeting tonight is going to be budget. It's going to be the financial resource constraints this district is facing. And far from being unrelated topics, we're dealing with a budget crunch and COVID at the same time, and far from being unrelated, meeting expectations, whether they be the expectations of the Commonwealth or expectations of our families. Moving away from the model we have now is going to consume resources. So I'm wondering, Dr. Sawyer, if you might be able to elaborate a little bit on where the element of cost and cash might come into play.
Sure.
If we were to dramatically expand our in-person offerings on a quick basis.
Right. And I'll ask Mr. Collins to chime in after I give sort of the broad contours of what this could look like. In terms of straight out resources, and, I've been on conference calls with other superintendents from other school districts who are looking and trying and even already bringing kids back in different ways depending on their circumstances. Some of that goes to physical items where some districts are choosing to buy furniture that they otherwise would not need, just to provide the kinds of furniture they think will help facilitate some of the distancing that they would put together to bring more kids back. That is something that in terms of financial resources, I think would be very challenging for us at this point. The other, I know I spoke to a superintendent in a district that are bringing kids back in younger grades, I think maybe K through 2. And in order to do that, because, we've talked about this before, having to service the students who are all remote creates an economy of scale problem where we would have had one teacher teaching a class, say, of 23 kids. Now we have, an in-person class where 6 or so of those kids decided to be remote, and that happens to another class, but there's not enough, we can't consolidate the in-person classes, but we have to stand up a remote class as well. So instead of 2 teachers for 2 classes of 23, now we have 3 teachers teaching that same number of students. In order to make that work in bringing students back, there could be the need to hire additional staff, which of course is incredibly challenging at this point during the school year. And again, not really the resources available to do that. We added a lot of staff just to be able to stand up our remote program and do what we're doing now. So that would be another resource piece. Beyond that, just because of where we're at as a school district, we're about to, we would like to open a new school next year because we have crowding in our elementary schools. Because we have crowded situation in our elementary schools, we don't have the kind of extra space that some other districts have to convert spaces into additional classrooms, where you might need an additional teacher, but you could also spread kids out more. That's something that we don't really have the luxury of. And certainly at the middle school level, where we have this year class sizes of 27 on average in our 5th grade because we cut 2 teachers this year. That's going to be harder for us to bring all kids back in person than it would be for a district that only has 20 or 22 students in a class. So those are some resource pieces. I'll ask Mr. Collins to speak a little bit to some of the logistical challenges resource-wise that we would need to use. Potentially COVID funding, and there may be more of that coming with federal stimulus. But there's other pieces that are, not to be exhaustive, but maybe something from an operations perspective, Mr. Collins, if you could share.
Sure, I guess, the first part that I would just talk about would be school transportation. And, one of the things that the commissioner did actually, it was about a week and a half ago or so now, was to change the guidance on school transportation ridership. And so based upon recent scientific studies really kind of coming out of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, the Department of Ed has basically lifted the ridership cap on that they imposed on school transportation previously under some conditions, one being that you're in a low incidence community of COVID, and number 2, that the windows remain open on the buses. And so while we prepared our budget for this school year, we did 2 things. One is we planned for full utilization of our existing fleet, which we have been operating 4 days a week fully, and we planned not to take in any bus fees as part of the plan. So from a school transportation perspective, I think we're going to be fine as we take on more kids every single day, if you will, since all cohorts would be on the buses now back 5 days a week as opposed to spreading them out in different cohorts over those same 5 days. So I don't see transportation as a problem. What I do see, in terms of financial resources is, of course, the moving back in of furniture. We did it in a very cost-effective way over the summertime with lots of student volunteers and had some bit of luxury of time. Now we're going to have a very concentrated effort. We'll have to hire moving companies to work on weekends, which could be premium prices, weekends or evenings, in addition to paying our own custodial staff overtime to help put classrooms back together. We did when we received the most recent round of grant funding called ESSER 2, which was about $525,000. We've just plugged, not with a lot of detailed planning, but set aside $50,000 from that grant to pay for the moving back in process. So we'll rely on COVID grants for those types of expenditures in terms of moving things back in. In terms of other resources that are, not financial, but really critically important is, or more important, I think, in terms of having the time to do this and plan appropriately, as Dr. Sawyer mentioned, the complexities of putting classrooms back together. And, right now, we're just talking about elementary schools only. So having the time to do that, and we have a compressed time frame, if we're talking about April, and the space. Space is going to be a limiting factor if the 3-foot minimum distancing is still a requirement. If it's a guideline, that's a different piece. And I think if we're in an environment where staff are fully vaccinated by that, the time frame then becomes maybe of lesser import. But if it persists as a requirement, that's going to be a limiting factor for us. Space and time are really critical factors. So I know it's a little bit longer than you expected, but in terms of some of the hard costs, whether it be additional teachers or, moving companies, we plan to rely on that federal stimulus funding, so-called ESSER 3 grant right now.
Thank you. Cole.
John?
Yeah, first off, I'd like to thank Dr. Sawyer for these updates. Always very detailed, and the numbers are very encouraging. In particular, the pool testing at the high school, very well done. It has to be encouraging for both, families and staff to see these really good negative numbers. My daughter will be participating in pool testing starting tomorrow at the high school. She's a freshman. I do have some serious concerns with regards to the logistical planning behind the announcement that was made yesterday by the state. I think we all know, in this meeting at least, the Herculean effort it took to, make these classrooms ready for hybrid model. And I know Patrick just, answered a lot of the questions that I had in terms of that, but I think it's important to level set expectations here. Yesterday's message, if you just listen to it high level, is, back in full by, April, right? So I think we need to understand what this is going to take for our district to meet that expectation. And I know it's going to mature over the next few weeks, but it's just important to understand that there's a lot of planning behind it. There are certainly funding concerns as well with regards to the moving assistance that's needed, because during the summer, we relied heavily on volunteers to make what you see today happen. So just be curious to see how this evolves over time, but I think it's important for the public to understand that this is, certainly going to be a challenge, so.
Absolutely. Dale?
I just want to, as I listen to this conversation here, I want to just take out the highlighter on one pair of facts. And that is, what I'm hearing is that with class sizes as they exist, we're going to be challenged getting back to full-time in-person classes, especially if the 3-foot rule holds. And so we're going to struggle with that. By the same token, this process could easily stretch into FY '22. And we're also talking about increasing class size. So in some ways, this budget issue could be paralyzing our return to full-time in-person classes. And I think it's important to highlight those two things that are conspiring to undermine the quality of education that we are providing.
Yeah, and I think you raise a really good point, because we're talking about this current budget cycle, and this came out of left field a little yesterday when we all heard about it. But, we're also looking at a budget reduction plan that Dr. Sawyer will be talking about shortly, but this will have a tail into that budget cycle as well. And there's a lot of ramifications as we move forward, so it's a lot to think about. Lindsay?
I want to say I appreciate the, where DESE is trying to encourage the state to move. Fundamentally, as a parent with smaller kids, I would like my kids back in school more. I know that's not the consensus of everybody in the world and in the community, and I'm glad we're going to continue to have options for people for whom that doesn't feel like the right choice for them or their family. But, you know, while we know it is a huge lift, I don't want the public to also think that we are opposed in any way and think that, you know, I personally feel like this is the right move. It's a timing problem, it's a coordination problem, it's a funding problem, it presents lots of challenges, and certainly I agree with Dr. McGee that our budget and our space issues conflate to make this even more difficult for us as a community right now, and our staff sizes, and I think the lack of clarity that I personally perceived in the guidance that came out about 3 feet versus 6 feet, and including lunch, which adds this other layer of complexity about taking masks off and being, you know, I have a kiddo at Patton, and the cafegimatorium is not a big room, and you know, the seats are the seats, right? They're built in, and so there's only so much space there. So, you know, I know it is hard, and I guess well, a part of me is sort of glad we're starting to think about this. I also know that as a district, we don't have a lot of capacity right now on the administrative side to be doing this planning and dealing with a budget issue that says, now let's think about which teachers and which positions we need to cut. And so we are in a really untenable position, and I appreciate the work of the staff to kind of be, yet again, having another ball to juggle. But you know, I know there's many in the parent community who are eager and asking when and how is this going to happen, and it will take us time. But I just want to thank you for all the work, because this is more and more, and to also just make sure people really heard the focus on the elementary level. At the high school, we know we have a very different model of remote learning happening, and that we're right now not talking about that. We're talking about our younger learners. So I hope that parents kind of hear that and have some expectations about what we can do and when we can do it. But thank you for all the efforts.
And I think these, as John mentioned, these reports are really helpful every meeting, because we're almost a year into this, and it just shows the changing landscape. There's so many things that are cyclical and changing that we have to adapt, and we have to educate students every day. And there are many things that we have to kind of play catch up with, but the student education has to continue. So thank you for everything you're doing, and it is a lot of work.
Thank you, and I appreciate the comments and the questions, and I think, you know, just to emphasize again, we've continued, and I think I commend our educators. As we've gone through this year, they continue to try to figure out ways to make sure that we're trying to provide the best education service possible to our students under the circumstances. I want to commend the educational leadership team. You know, we continue to look at, I mean, we've been planning for next year since October. You know, with the hope, of course, that the pandemic will have generally passed by then. We're back to more normalcy by next fall. But obviously, we've also been looking at if we're able to do something this spring. The case counts obviously were very concerning in the early winter. We were encouraged by what's happened recently, but we will continue to work together with our staff and with our employee associations as we look at how we can navigate this together. You know, one of the side benefits, of course, for educators, it's been extremely difficult to plan for having some kids in person and some kids at home different days, and you know, planning basically for 2-3 different cohorts of students. It is very complicated. And I know that that's something that certainly, when we're able to bring students back into one essential in-person cohort, that should reduce the complexity greatly in terms of some of the work that teachers have had to do. But obviously, we want to do that in a way that is as safe as it possibly can be under the circumstances. So with that, we'll continue to work, we'll continue to communicate, and we'll be surveying families shortly.
Thank you. Okay, next we're going to move on to our redistricting of elementary school attendance zones, and we'll be taking a vote tonight. Just as a reminder, at our meeting on January 20th, the redistricting committee did present 2 recommended proposals for the committee. And at our January 27th meeting, we hosted a public hearing, and we received feedback from the community. And after receiving feedback via email in the public hearing, we also had analysis which was provided by our legal counsel. And tonight, Dr. Sawyer will make his recommendation for a redistricting plan for our elementary schools.
Thank you, Ms. Fritz. I appreciate the introduction and looking forward to making this recommendation. And just to get right out of the gate with what it will be, that after consideration, and this is taken right from the memorandum that the school committee received from me, the redistricting committee, which has a huge amount of weight because that is really, as I think I mentioned in my memo, it's one of the most thoughtful and effective committees I've served on during my time in Shrewsbury over 2 decades. And really appreciate the work that those parents and elementary principals, Mr. Collins, Mr. Wensky, Ms. Fritz, did to really work through what's a very complex issue. I also looked carefully at the feedback from families that school committees received and I've received, examined the legal analysis that was provided to us by our counsel, and then looking, obviously my own professional judgment. Ultimately, I recommend to the school committee to vote to adopt scenario 19 as the redistricting plan that we would use when we're able to open the Beal School fully. As far as the reasons for that recommendation, I do believe that it does represent the best balance of the school committee's guiding principles for redistricting. I think the guiding principles provided an excellent holistic view of how we should approach this issue. Secondly, because it's recommended by the redistricting committee, they were so careful and thoughtful about looking at the different options and also considering very substantive public input to their level before it got to the school committee level. Thirdly, excuse me, here we go. It represents what I think are reasonable adjustments from what was first brought forward to the school committee, which is essentially scenario 18, I think, is one of the balanced option. Some reasonable adjustments were made on some of the edges of the boundaries based on specific parent feedback that ultimately made sense, I think, to the redistricting committee and brought forward that additional scenario. And then fourth, I do think it represents this holistic approach. It does provide equitable instructional spaces across the school district at the elementary level, which is one thing that was really a key element of doing this, building this new school and redistricting. There's emphasis on neighborhood cohesion. It definitely takes a neighborhood community approach and keeps neighborhoods intact. It provides diversity among the school student populations, and I'll speak to that a little bit more later in the presentation. It has an excellent chance of maintaining boundaries over a longer period of time. Obviously, redistricting is something that's not something you want to go through frequently. I don't know if we'll meet the standard we set when Floral Street School opened, when we haven't redistricted for over 20 years. But it was thoughtfully done in terms of projecting out into the future as to how these populations would evolve over time based on the excellent work that our AppGeo, who's our consultant with GIS information and enrollment projections, were able to help us with. And then fifth, it minimizes school changes. One of the guiding principles was to not change students unless we had to. And this option, compared to most other options that we looked at, minimize the number of students who would actually have to shift schools under the plan. Additionally, number 5, based on the information and under state statute, none of our schools would be considered racially isolated under the state's definition. And then I think a very important point, the 6th point here, is that our students' educational needs, this was actually the first guiding principle. We're going to meet all of our students' needs, regardless of where they attend school. Each school in Shrewsbury, each elementary school now, and will continue when we open the new Beal, will employ the same curriculum and assessment standards, best instructional practices, and have highly qualified educators. We have extremely high qualified and high quality staff in every single one of our schools. That does not differ because of where a particular school might happen to be located in town. And that's something that will continue to be the case. And as a result, I am very confident that regardless of what school a student is assigned, they are going to get what they need educationally to be successful. And that's critically important, I think, under any of these scenarios. A couple of slides I want to share, because I know this came up in some of the public comment at the last meeting when this was presented. It has to do with the percentages of students by race and ethnicity. This is used taking data directly from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education that's publicly available under the school profile section on their website. You can see this by this bar chart. I think the key thing to look at is the top number, which is 70. And when, I know some of the race and ethnicity data on some of the slides that were provided previously in previous presentations bunched these all together into a little bit more of a, not separated out as much by the different categories. These categories, there are a couple of additional categories, Native American, Pacific Islander, have so few students that it didn't make sense to include them in these graphics. But in these 5 race and ethnic categories that we're required to report to the state, because the state reports them to the federal government, which are African American, Asian, Hispanic, white, and multi-race, but non-Hispanic. The way that it's, is that Hispanic is considered to be an ethnicity, and when families enroll, they choose whether or not their child's Hispanic, and then they also choose next what race their child might be. So they might choose Hispanic and then white, or Hispanic and then African American, or Hispanic and multi-race. If the way the state runs these statistics is that if someone chooses Hispanic, they're categorized by the state as Hispanic, regardless of what race they chose. If they don't choose Hispanic, if they're non-Hispanic, then they would be categorized into one of these other areas. And the definition in the state, under an old state statute from the mid-1970s, having to do with trying to reduce racial isolation and segregation in Massachusetts schools, defines a racially isolated school as one that is less than 30% non-white. Or another way of saying that, of course, would be 70% or greater white. And you can see under scenario 19, none of our schools would have more than 70% white students. They would vary to some degree, depending on, typically the Asian and white populations are the biggest swings, depending on which student population inhabits that school. But you can see what that looks like on that basis. Of interest on the next slide is a line graph that goes back to the year when we redistricted last, when Floral Street School opened. When Floral Street School opened, our K-4 population was 90% white. You can see that green line trending down over time to, over the last couple of years, actually dip below 50%. So overall, our K-4 student population is a majority non-white in our school district and has been now for a couple of years. You can see that the major difference there is that the red line, which is Asian, has trended up considerably. When Floral Street School opened, about 5% of the K-4 population was Asian. That now is approaching 35% plus. So you can see that's been the main contributing factor as well. You can see the other lines as far as Hispanic and white. Multi-race, non-Hispanic has only been kept for the last 10 years or so. Much smaller populations in our schools. The Hispanic has increased, rate has increased from about, I think, 2% back when in 1998 to about 9% today overall. But you can see that the trend, and if the trend continues on a school-by-school basis, and you have many more detailed graphs in your packet that accompany your memo that show if the trends for all of our schools continue, all of our schools over time are going to become majority non-white. Obviously we can't predict the future, but if the trends continue, that's what will be happening. And certainly I appreciate the much more rich mix of diversity that we have now in our school district than when I first came here in 1997 when Floral Street School opened. So with that, again, the recommendation that I have for you this evening is to adopt scenario 19 as the redistricting plan. We think it's important to adopt this evening because it does facilitate the planning that we need to do behind the scenes. I am going to be optimistic that we'll be able to open the Beal School in full next year. And when we do, in order to do that, there is a lot of work that has to happen relative to transportation, communication with families, and so on. And maybe before I complete and turn it over to the committee, would ask Mr. Collins just to speak a little bit to some of those logistical pieces that make a decision now helpful in terms of doing this work.
Sure, thank you, Dr. Sawyer. I think, primarily the benefit of the school committee voting this evening on this decision contingent upon opening of the new Beal School is very important from a timing perspective. In terms of the school operations, it gives us definition and some ability to do advanced planning, because what we would get from this is definition about which scenario is adopted and which students will be in which school next year. In terms of rostering classrooms, it's critically important that that effort begin as soon as possible amongst all the other priorities that principals are juggling, making sure that classes are balanced in terms of gender, special education students, students with English language learning needs, and making sure that also internally that we're staff planning appropriately for where students are going to be attending school next year. So having the ability to do that and create a file that gives us the look ahead, gives us additional planning time, which is critically important when you're trying to juggle multiple urgent priorities. I think also, just from a parent perspective, it gives them a keen sense of certainty as well, of course, contingent upon opening the school, but not leaving it as an open question, knowing that if we're going to fully open up Beal School, where their child is going to be, or if we're not going to, that it's going to be status quo. But if the school committee doesn't vote that, then it leaves parents questioning, well, we're not really sure. It could be scenario 18 or maybe some other scenario or what have you. So I think the timing is very important, and I would urge the committee to make a decision this evening.
So with that, I also just want to let the committee know that our consultant from MapGeo, Priya Sankalia, is with us this evening remotely if there are any technical questions about the data that the committee might have. And other than that, that is my recommendation. Again, deeply appreciate the thoughtful recommendation that the Redistricting Committee made. That made this certainly much easier on my part and for my consideration. I'm in this role. And at this, I'll turn it over to Ms. Fritz and the committee for any questions that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Any questions or comments from the committee? Ms. Heffernan?
Let's see, where to begin. So, Dr. Collins, I appreciate the need for some clarity and finality to help with planning. I think it is incredibly important at the outset to be clear that this vote is a contingent vote. And based on funds being available, I personally am not yet confident about that at all. And I worry that that those listening may get the message that 2 weeks ago we weren't ready, but now we're ready, so we must have found some money somewhere, and that is wholly untrue. We still have a $5 million gap to fill. And so while I am hopeful that our community is going to make the right choice and we're going to move in the direction of an override such that we can open this school, as of this moment, we don't actually know that. And on the other hand, having 19 potential plans is too many plans. That's an unreasonable way to move forward. And so that a vote tonight essentially moves us as a district to two plans. A plan A, which is sort of a status quo, or a plan B, if we were to go with Dr. Sawyer's recommendation of scenario 19. And while 19 plans is too many, 2 is a lot more manageable. It will continue to be, taking this vote tonight, hard for staff to plan, both administrators and teachers who want to know what building they're going to be in and how big their class sizes are going to be. It certainly is hard for us to communicate, and I think it's incumbent upon us to make clear what this vote is and what it is not. And it's hard for families to deal with uncertainty. We're maybe adding a little bit more certainty, but it continues to definitely be an uncertain world for where your children are going to go to school. That being said, we have far too much uncertainty in the year of COVID, and if we can bring a little bit of it, I think it's the right choice to move forward with a vote tonight. In terms of the recommendation, I am a person who believes in good process, and especially for hard decisions. And I think that we have had an incredibly good process here, and that doesn't in any way mitigate the fact that it is a hard decision that we have to make. But I think the work of the committee has been thoughtful and transparent, and the recommendation of scenario 19 is in no way arbitrary. The data that we have looked at, the discussions that we have had, and the feedback that we have gotten from the community, I am happy that we received feedback, and then we tweaked our plans, and we tried to think about ways to mitigate some impacts that maybe we hadn't thought of. And so I'm always happy when that happens. And I know that the group of individuals who have been involved, for whom I am incredibly thankful, really have focused on the many factors one needs to consider in going into a decision like this. I also am confident that as a community and as a district, that we have done our due diligence regarding racial composition, that we have certainly talked to legal experts, but also looked at the data, and I have come to a place where I feel that this is a solid plan. I believe scenario 19, I hope it serves us well and we get 20 years out of it as a community that is changing rapidly. I don't know if that's the case anymore, but 20 years seems like a long time for anything these days. But I would be supportive moving forward tonight with scenario 19. Again, just as a reminder to the community that we have a go, no-go date that we're getting closer and closer to. Even if we make a vote tonight, that we may have to be on the status quo side. And so I hope that parents can continue to live with that degree of uncertainty. Thank you.
Jason?
I want to echo Ms. Heffernan's starting point. In particular, I want to emphasize to families who are watching, to the community, that this is a decision we make tonight, if we make it tonight, for logistical, organizational, and planning reasons. And we are not in a position to communicate definitively to this community that Beal School is going to open as the K through 4 elementary school that we hoped for and envisioned. That was something that was made plain to the public at our last meeting. It is something we need to continue to make plain tonight. It is something that the superintendent is going to have to add a distressing layer of additional distress and detail to in just a short while. We are not able to communicate to families that the dream of a new K through 4 school, of space improvements, class size improvements, expanded kindergarten opportunities, are going to become a reality. And so tonight, as we make a decision on a redistricting plan, we are needing to remind the entire community that this is a hope, not a finality. Having said that, with the decision before us and having carefully looked at all of the options, I find myself in agreement with, again, Ms. Heffernan and the superintendent regarding scenario 19. I think it is the scenario that not only meets the most of the district's desires and goals going into this process, but also makes the most logistical sense. I do want to speak a minute about scenario 16. I am pleased that scenario 16 was brought before this committee. I appreciate the level of thought and creativity that went into trying to give greater focus to racial equity, which is something that this committee has talked about, this district has talked about, this community has been talking about, and needs to continue to talk about more. I think that the consideration of scenario 16 enhanced the quality of this dialogue and enhanced the quality of our deliberations. One thing that certainly caught my attention about scenario 16 early on, and it was emphasized in the superintendent's recommendation tonight, is the logistical costs around transportation that would come with it. There are other districts that could look perhaps at additional busing costs and say that that's something that they just want to step past because maybe for other reasons it's something they want to do. This is not a district, sadly, that gets to look past that. This is another example. This is the second time tonight I found myself talking about something ostensibly unrelated, but here I am talking about the budget again. Shrewsbury Public Schools doesn't get to look at a cost that might be a little bit too much and say, well, we can get past that because it's the right thing to do. I know we all want to do that. I know our community wants to do that. That's not the position we're in. This district has a list a mile long of things we would rather not do or do differently, but for our cost structure and our revenue limitations. We fee for just about everything we can. We charge families to send their kids to kindergarten full day. We charge families for the kids to play sports or to join a club or music lessons in some circumstances. The list of things we would like to explore or possibilities we would like to consider if there were not resource constraints is a very, very long one. And we are not a district that gets to look past a cost and say, well, no, with this is just something we want to do. We are burdened by that reality. And so I find myself being unable to look past the logistical restrictions there. And I do accept the superintendent's recommendation and will be voting to accept the recommendation of scenario 19.
Thank you. John?
I agree with my colleagues. I won't repeat what you said. I think messaging is important here. And really, nothing has changed since our last meeting 2 weeks ago. We're still not sure yet if we can even have the operational override question asked. So it kind of prevents us from dreaming about Beal opening, right? So I think it's important, as I said in the previous segment, if you will, about level setting expectations here. But in the interests of planning, certainly I support the recommendation by Dr. Sawyer with scenario 19. From my perspective, it is the most balanced across all guiding principles. Having sat on this committee, I think it definitely minimizes change. It gives you the adequate space for learning. It's logistically sound in terms of transportation needs, with a focus on retaining neighborhood schools. I think it's also important to acknowledge the extensive work in this process. The committee work was very comprehensive, very detailed, very thoughtful across all the scenarios we reviewed over many months. I just personally, again, being on the committee, just being in front of all this, I'd like to thank the parents and the administrators on the committee for their time and effort and their engagement. Also appreciate all the work that Mr. Collins and his expertise provided to the process. You can tell he had done this many times before. And also the partnership with AppGeo. They made a very complex process a lot easier to navigate. I think at the end of the day, the success for all students is paramount, right? Change is hard. It's impossible to achieve 100% satisfaction. But I think, in this case, the high quality of education remains the same across all schools. And while the physical buildings might change for some students, the high standards of the district do not change. Those will remain the same. So, thank you.
And I agree with everything my colleagues have said, and I think when we started this process and we set those guiding principles, that was the mission that we set, to have a balance of those, and we knew there would not be a perfect balance, but scenario 19 is as best as we could. I agree with Jason, having scenario 16 was a way of making sure that the community knew that the committee did look at socioeconomic diversity, racial equity, and that was something that the committee looked at throughout the process. And I think having the public comment, getting feedback from the community actually helped us look deeper into what we have been doing as a community and looking more into the data. And looking at scenario 19 became, for us, for myself, looking at that this was the best scenario. And again, nothing's perfect, and I know this is a difficult decision for those families that are having their students move, but I do agree that this is the best scenario out of everything that we looked at over the months as a committee. I do want to thank the committee members. I agree with Dr. Sawyer. I've been on a lot of committees. This was such a great group to work with, so thoughtful, caring, and really looked at all four corners of this to make sure that this was the right decision for a very difficult decision for families. So I am fully on board with this as well. Is there any further questions, comments, anything additional, Dr. Sawyer?
No, thank you.
Okay. May I have a motion that the committee vote to adopt scenario 19 as recommended by the Redistricting Committee as the redistricting plan for the Shrewsbury Public Schools elementary attendance zones when the new Bale School fully opens?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Okay, next, we're going to move on to Dr. Sawyer's fiscal year 22 budget reduction plan. As you know, Dr. Sawyer presented his initial budget recommendation at our last meeting. Mr. Mizikar had presented his fiscal projection, and there is a budget gap of 4.9 million. And in order to have a balanced budget, we are now presenting a budget reduction plan.
Thank you, Ms. Fritz. I'll begin the presentation with a recap of what I provided to the committee and the community when I presented 2 weeks ago, to emphasize again that I believe that our school district is facing an education emergency, and that is not a term that I would use lightly or hyperbolically. The reason why is that the pandemic has created what is the greatest crisis we've faced regarding the academic and social and emotional needs of our children for decades. And the students in Shrewsbury are counting on us to help them. We have a structural funding dilemma that we've struggled with for years in our town, and that is threatening to severely compromise our ability to meet our students' needs next year at really a critical time when they need our strong support. Reducing our schools' resources next year because of the structural funding program, unfortunately, would compound the damage that's being done as a result of the pandemic. And so next year, more than ever, we really need our community to provide the resources necessary to meet our students' needs. To remind people as presented, in case they weren't watching last week, I made a recommendation for a $75.4 million budget, which would be an increase of $7.4 million, which represents an almost 11% increase year over year. And would refer people to that budget presentation relative to the details regarding that, because it's only to bring forward what we have now and to provide the new staff available that we would need to be available to open the Beal School as intended. It does not restore any of the 30 cuts we made for this year, which totaled almost $2 million worth of cuts. All it does is preserve what we have and provide the staff we need to open the new Beal School as intended. So that's important to keep in mind. In terms of the budget gap that we have, it's a $4.9 million deficit, as Ms. Fritz mentioned. You can see the figures there based on my recommendation. The additional cost of $1.7 million to open the new Beal, the combined budget in comparison to what was provided in the first budget recommendation from the town manager, which he is constrained, of course, by what's available for revenue. It's not a commentary by any means on what we should have as a school district, but basically what's available in the town coffers and what could be moved forward to provide services for municipal and schools next year. So that's what the budget gap represents. The amount year over year is larger. Last week or 2 weeks ago, Mr. Collins explained in detail that not only because of the normal cost inflation factors that you have in a school district, but we took two very large types of one-time savings this year as quote-unquote survival tactics. One is that our employees either deferred compensation raises or took freezes, and in doing so, saved a great deal of money and sacrificed dollars that will not come back into their pockets at any point. But in order to get from that lower number this year to the number that they would be at in their contract for next year, it's just a bigger year-over-year increase to get there. So that's part of the reason that the pressure is on. In addition, savings we experienced last spring because of the school closure in transportation, substitute costs, and the like, we utilized this year, again, to essentially buy down what it cost us this year and avoid even further cuts beyond the 30 positions and $2 million we had to cut because we didn't have enough funding available. And thank goodness we had the various COVID grants to be able to fund the necessary additional staff and enhanced cleaning and all the other things that go with running schools during the pandemic. Okay, with that, I am going to turn it over at this point to Mr. Collins to take you through a few more of the technical slides. Anything he wants to add to this slide, and before I talk a little bit about reduction plan for next year.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. So in terms of the next slide, I think this, just wanted to point out that, we're talking a lot about, unfortunately, survival tactics, educational emergencies, and what we're not talking about, I think it's important to mention, is working towards achieving our strategic priorities, and we're not talking about making improvements relative to our district improvement plan. This school district, its administrators, and the school committee spent lots of time developing our strategic priorities and our district improvement plans with very specific goals set out and timelines. And unfortunately, fiscal '22 will be the second consecutive year where we are not bringing any recommendations forward to the school committee for any funding, any initiatives to support the achievement of either of those plans. And that's not where we want to be as a community. We know that if you stand still too long, you're just basically sliding into mediocrity and then eventually decline. And that's not what we believe that this community aspires to be. The last time that we did ask, typically as part of an annual budgeting process in an organization like ours, we would solicit our district leaders for their input into the budget process for the succeeding year and ask them what resources they think they need in order to help us achieve our strategic priorities and district improvement plan. The last time we did that, back for fiscal '20, what came forward was $2.4 million worth of staffing, equipment, supplies, educational materials. Very, very little of that $2.4 million was actually funded, and the stuff that was funded was primarily funded with grants that were sought by the district or private funding. So this is not a place where we want to be, where we're talking about, again, just survival tactics. In terms of some more specific data pieces, again, we've shown this before, but basically, when we're talking about budget cutting and analyzing budgets, people want to know where we are in terms of our spending and cost efficiencies. For fiscal '19, Shrewsbury ranked 286th out of 320 school districts, the bottom 11% of all school districts in Massachusetts in terms of spending per pupil. We were at $14,248 per pupil, while the state average was $17,149. And Dr. Sori makes mentions of this often, that if you were to take that dollar difference and multiply it times our student enrollment, just over 6,200 students, that would mean we would be utilizing another $18.6 million annually just to be at the state average in terms of spending per pupil. To break it down a little bit more, and I know it's hard to read at home, but this total spending per pupil gets broken down by the Department of Education. Again, these are all statistics produced by the Department of Education into other more definitive categories like administration, teacher costs, guidance, counseling, and testing, operations and maintenance, and I won't read through them all, but all categories with the exception of two, one you might expect that we are spending less than the state average. The two categories where we are spending more than the state average, other teaching services, basically includes our paraprofessional group and speech and occupational therapy services. In the professional development category, which again, frankly, is probably a good place to be spending more than the state average, which is providing support to our teaching staff through professional development, also includes costs for our instructional coaches, dues and memberships to professional associations, and then costs for outside trainers for our staff. So that's a more detailed breakdown, and you can see, for example, under administration, we are far under the state average, 35% less than the state average spending per pupil on administration, which is a topic that we often get asked about. In terms of spending per pupil in a smaller subset, this group here is communities of similar socioeconomics and is provided by ClearGov. Again, we fare very well there against North Attleboro, Arlington, Belmont, Franklin, Chelmsford, and Natick. We are lesser than all but one in that group. And then finally, just in terms of putting our cost per pupil for education, again, this red bar, which is the bottom 11% in the state, and kind of juxtaposing that with personal income, which is the green bar, where we, as a community, we're in the top 20% in terms of income per capita. We rank 70th out of 351 communities. And in terms of property value, we rank in the top 14%, or 49th out of 341 communities. So those two things, of course, are opposing one another in terms of wealth versus investment in education. And so at this point, I'll turn it over back to Dr. Sawyer to talk about the budget reduction plan details.
Thank you. Before I get into some of the specifics, I think it's important to note, and I don't have a slide on this, but we'll talk about it a little bit later in the presentation, but I think it makes pragmatic sense. that we're facing a $4.9 million deficit, and part of that is due to the need to add 32 positions in order to open the new Beal School, that the very first thing that we would do is not add those staff, which would not enable us to open the new school as planned. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about that and how it might affect kindergarten later in the presentation. But the first way to reduce the $5 million deficit, almost $5 million, is to take that $1.7 million off the top. In addition to that, as we go through the recommendations for reductions, I think it's important to note a couple of things. First off, we made a lot of reductions for the current year, and this has been in sort of diminishing amounts of money we've been able to invest in things like curriculum materials, professional development, et cetera, since we had the successful override and increased the school budget back in 2014. We've made operational cuts in a variety of ways. We've not increased our already bare bones amounts of money that we provide to principals to run their buildings and to department heads to try to advance and make sure that they have materials that they need in their various departments. We are very, very lean already when it comes to any operational elements. So there really is no place to go when it comes to making any significant reductions in operations. And that also goes for, as Mr. Collins just pointed out, one of the areas that we are absolute lowest in terms of per pupil expenditures is on administration. And administration not only includes your principals and assistant principals and your central office administrators, it also includes secretarial and clerical support. We are stretched when it comes to those kinds of roles. We have to operate the district according to a whole variety of things that we're required to do by state mandate or just by normal needs to operate schools efficiently and effectively. And so there really is no place to go that I can see where we are already extremely lean. And another area that people always ask about when we're in a cutting mode is around things that are not directly in the classroom relative to different kinds of student experiences, such as co-curricular activities. And the reality in Shrewsbury is that we have families pay such a large proportion of the cost of those programs that to reduce any significant money from the school budget for those programs would require the level of cuts that would decimate those kind of opportunities for students. I think we've seen more than ever, I referred to this a little bit in the superintendent's report at the start of the meeting, how critically important some of these activities are for our students. And so even under the circumstances where it did not, we could even move the needle a bit, taking away opportunities for things like robotics or speech and debate or theater and drama productions, concerts or athletics, the kinds of things that are critical parts of a student's development, would be difficult under any circumstance. But frankly, because parents pay for so much of that already, cutting them doesn't do a whole lot for our budget. So you'll not see anything of that in the plan as well. So those are just some opening comments before I get into what is a very painful conversation to have. The first area, again, we don't have a lot we can do operationally, but we always look to see are there ways we can shift costs or defer costs to try to take some of the pressure off of the increase. One place that we're doing that is with shifting costs for 2 of the information technology specialists that we hired this year because we increased the number of, we were already unfortunately understaffed when it came to IT support. But then when we added so many devices this year and went to an iPad model all the way K through 12, we really couldn't function effectively without these positions. They're funded this year through a COVID grant. We believe we'll have sufficient funding in our COVID grants to last through next year. So shifting that about $150,000 in costs to the COVID grant for 1 more year is something we feel is reasonable to do. Secondly, our Microsoft Office license is up for renewal. The version we have is no longer supported. We were scheduled to make about a $55,000 investment to keep that up to date. And Mr. LaRue has made it clear that he thinks we can make it through 1 more year. It's not without some risk around bugs and being able for the software to function properly. It's mainly software that we use more administratively than instructionally, although it does, there certainly are teachers who use the Microsoft suite as well. But it's something we feel we can squeak by another year without having to upgrade. So those are 2 cost shifts that really don't do any particular damage, maybe create a little bit of risk and push off some costs to a future date. The next category is administration. There are 2 areas that I recommend that we make administrative cuts. both that would continue some things that we're doing currently this year. The first is not to fund the principal position at Parker Road Preschool. We would then take the Parker Road Preschool team chair role and eliminate that, shift that role to a director of preschool. That's how we're functioning right now with an interim director because the principal took a medical leave for this year and indicated she's not returning. So rather than hire a new principal and go back to the mode we were in, sort of stay in this mode and save those costs. There's some grant funding and tuition funding that funds part of that, but the bottom line reduction to the budget is just over $125,000. Similarly, last year, the patent principalship opened when a principal moved to another district. And Jane Lizotte, Dr. Lizotte, who's the Assistant Superintendent for Community Partnerships and Wellbeing, graciously stepped into that role as acting principal at Patton and stabilized that school during obviously an incredibly difficult time with the pandemic. Dr. Lizotte deserves the credit for coming forward and indicating that given all of the change that's happening, knowing that the pandemic piece continues to evolve, and we'll be looking at all the different elements that go back to coming back into school in person over the coming year, and also given the significant changes that will be happening, either because we have to execute these budget cuts, which will be terrible, or if the community steps up, as I believe it will, we're able to open the new Beal, there's going to be a lot of change at all of our elementary schools. And Dr. Lizotte indicated to me that she did not think that adding another layer of change to the Patton community would be wise at this time, and so she indicated she is willing and wanted to continue in the acting principal role for the next year. And I appreciate, I'm not surprised, but I appreciate that that's Dr. Lizotte's approach here. So my recommendation is to continue, frankly, under any scenario, is to continue with this into next year so that we are able to maintain that leadership stability at Patton School. Next on the list, we move out of administration into what is a recommendation that I can't tell you I would ever think I would be making in a community like Shrewsbury. This is not a community that should be thinking about having to close its elementary media centers because we don't have enough money. Those are the kinds of things that you see in communities that are not able to financially sustain themselves, which I don't believe is the case in Shrewsbury, as the statistics that Mr. Collins shared a little while ago show. But this is a recommendation that I am making, that if we do need to cut this extraordinary sum of money from our budget, that with the elementary media specialist position, which is going to be vacant for next year because the person who occupies it is going to be shifting over to Oak Middle School. That was an approved transfer that hasn't happened yet because we haven't been able to backfill it this year. And so that position will remain open, and we would just not fund it for next year under the scenario. And then 6 individuals representing 5.7 FTE would also be cut from the budget. Our elementary media aides do an outstanding job at providing different kinds of access to the media centers, or libraries, as some would call them, each day to our students. They teach classes that are planned by the media specialist. It's also been something that has been shifting over time to include more technology, more integration of a variety of STEM subjects into the media center and research area. And it really is a very, very beneficial program for our students. I think it is important to note that going on, and I don't know how many years ago, it's got to be at least 15 years ago, we had, and probably more than that even, every one of our elementary media centers had a professional level licensed media specialist running it, with some different kind of assistance from aides and parents. A cut that was made many years ago, when I was still an elementary principal, I believe, took all those elementary specialists, media specialists, and reduced them to one, and then kept the media centers open by having these paraprofessional positions, these media aides, run them. We've made that model work to the best effect that we can, but it already is not the kind of model that peer districts like ours would have in their media centers. And what I'm presenting to you this evening would actually just close the media centers down and not allow that access because we just won't have the funding to provide the personnel to do it. And I have a pit in my stomach even talking about this, but this is the kind of situation that we find ourselves in. The next piece starts to get at reducing teachers and increasing class size. We'll start with elementary and move our way up through the grades. We would cut based on the projected class sizes we have next year. We would cut one grade 1 teacher from Spring Street School, which would increase class size there to 24. The upper range of the recommendation for grade 1 and 2 is 22 students. We would cut a grade 2 classroom teacher at Patton School. That would increase the class size there to 24 as well. When we look at grade 3, the damage is considerable. We would cut 5 third grade teachers. We certainly are trying to protect some of the younger grades, just given what we know coming out of the pandemic in terms of teaching kids to read. But third grade is also a critical year. And so it pains me to think about cutting 2 third grade teachers at Coolidge, 2 at Floral Street, 1 at Patton. Spring Street not adding one there, it's cut at the other grade level, but remaining only 3 positions at Spring Street, which is, as you can see, in some of those schools would create class sizes upwards of 29. And when we have class sizes averaging that high, we know we're going to have class sections of 30 or more, which is really, it's where we were. I recall prior to the override in 2014, in 2013, we had class sizes approaching 30 at Floral Street School in grade 2. This was where we'd end up in grade 3 if we have to execute this plan. For grade 4, we would cut 4 positions. That would raise class sizes at Coolidge, Floral Street, and Spring Street to 25. And of course, in some of our smaller schools, cutting even 1 teacher could raise class sizes above 30 right away. So we just endeavored to look at places where we would only, and I say only, raise those class size averages into the high 20s or mid to high 20s outside the range where they should be, which is 22 to 24 for the upper elementary grades. At Sherwood Middle School, last year we cut 2 fifth grade teachers, last year meaning this current school year, and raised class sizes there to about 27. We would do the same in grade 6 next year, which would also result in 27 class size averages across the board, which again we would expect would mean some sections would be greater than or equal to 30. So that would be additional pressure on class size at Sherwood. At Oak Middle School, this is a little logistically more challenging because we have 4 teacher teams at Oak Middle School. But to cut a 4-teacher team would put average class sizes already into the low 30s, which to me would be absolutely untenable. But having to cut 2 teachers at each grade level would put class sizes on average at 28. Again, would have some sections greater than or equal to 30. This will be logistically challenging. We either would have to figure out how to have some 2-person teams, which in we had that back when I was principal at Oak a couple times because of budget issues. But back then the licensure situation was much different. It's harder to have teachers at the upper middle school grades who are licensed for both subjects, say math and science or English and social studies. So we may have to do a combination team like we're doing this year under the pandemic circumstances where you'd have teachers teaching half 7th graders and half 8th graders. Again, not the model we want, not desirable, but maybe needing to do this under these incredibly challenging circumstances. As far as the high school, we would be cutting 12 professional educator level positions at the high school under this scenario. In talking with Mr. Basillo, the principal, likely these would be spread across multiple departments. We don't know yet exactly what reductions we would make because course selection's happening over this particular period of time. We'd have to look at what some of the different impacts would be. But we know the overall impact is going to be raising class sizes and also reducing the number of courses available to students, whether those are electives or not being able to take multiple courses in the same discipline because we don't have enough course sections to provide that opportunity to students, which of course has an impact on the kind of profile students are trying to put together for their college applications. There's lots of outcomes here, of course, but class sizes going up and course availability going down is going to be what happens if we have to cut that many people from the high school program. And as we have more details about what we would do, we will share that in subsequent presentations with the committee. Beyond that, in our K through 8 special subjects or allied arts programs, we would cut 3.5 additional positions. Essentially, we're going to be reducing class sections if we have to do this, which means instead of needing a certain number of 4th grade classes of art, we'd need fewer. The same for physical education or music or whatever the subject might be. Until we know more about how we would schedule all this out, we don't know exactly who this would affect. Essentially, it would either raise class sizes in these special classes, or, as in past years, kind of similar to this year, we cut the drama teacher from Oak Middle School, so we no longer provide drama for 7th and 8th grade students. This year, we cut foreign language at Sherwood Middle School and didn't cut that out of 6th grade. So, sometimes there's program pieces. So some of these special subjects will either have higher class sizes or fewer opportunities in certain places for students. Again, it's unknown at this time exactly which, but we are saying under this plan, we would cut the equivalent of 3.5 full-time equivalent positions to get to where we need to go for a budget reduction. In special education, it is really difficult to make budget cuts because the personnel that we hire to provide special education are tied to providing IEP services to students. Their individualized education plans, which are essentially legal contracts between the school district and the family about what will be provided. However, in looking at what we could do that's certainly, again, not desirable, but would stretch our resources in different ways, would be to reduce 2 of what are known as special education team chairs. These are educators who run the highly regulated individual education program or IEP process that requires very specific types of meetings with families based on legal timelines in order to provide the best planning for those plans, to develop those plans, and then to work to make sure that we're implementing the plans effectively with our students. That would ultimately require us to stretch the remaining team chairs across more schools and more cases. It would also require other special educators, whether teachers or other service providers, to chair their own IEP meetings in some of the less complex cases that are typically chaired and all the paperwork handled by the IEP special education team chair. Additionally, there's an occupational therapist position, a half-time position that we believe will be able to be reduced. And that would, of course, require increasing the caseload for the remaining occupational therapy staff. Finally, we would also, to make these reductions, cut the equivalent of 5 positions, our elementary general instructional aides. We made about, I think, a 60-hour reduction this year, so we've already reduced that. We made reductions up to before the override. A little bit after the override, we were able to restore some of those hours. They came out again this year, and this would further diminish that level of support for students at the elementary level. It would be equivalent of 2 at Floral Street and 1 each at Coolidge, Patton, and Spring Street. Principals would have to decide whether or not to reduce resources for our older students and focus them on younger, or look at deploying them in ways that go to the students who need the most help. But it would severely diminish our ability to respond to the extra help that many students need and these positions are able to provide. So again, something that has been a deteriorating resource over time that would be diminished even further. So to recap, that represents 48.7 full-time equivalent positions that would be reduced from the budget. 2 administrators, which represents of the 26 administrative positions, 7.6% of that employee group. It would be 36 teaching positions. You can see spread across 11 at elementary, 6 at middle, 12 at the high school, 4.5 specialists, allied arts across K through 8, 2.5 special education. Of note should be that the middle school took a particularly hard hit this year with the budget reductions we made, and didn't have a lot of other places to go there for sure. And then 10.7 paraprofessionals to get to that total of 48.7. That represents 7% of our teaching staff and 4% of our paraprofessional staff. And most of our paraprofessionals are tied to IEPs as well, so making further reductions there would also be complex. So that's the plan that I have laid out at this point. In terms of the recap of what that means financially, again, the first thing that we would take off the top would be the almost $1.7 million to add new staff for Beal. Then reducing $2.9 million, which would be another 48.7 positions. And so I think it's important to note that this is not just a reduction of 48.7 positions that we have in our schools today. It also reduces the planned positions that we would have to open the new school. So compared to the budget that I filed with you, it's actually a reduction of 81 positions. And that doesn't get us all the way there. There's $257,000, almost $258,000, that right now is undefined, that if we have to go all the way to close this entire gap, we would need to make even more reductions. We're holding off on that at this point. We know that, after the first filing that the town manager makes and after our first filing, we'll obviously continue to look at all the projections we're making for next year in all of our different cost areas. My hope would be that, even if there's no additional funding that could come through potentially an override, that we'd at least be able to, things would moderate a little bit, that we would have to make that additional $250,000 in cuts. But obviously, that's quite possible. It's obviously possible it could go in the other direction. That's happened some years as well. But right now, we felt that making these $2.9 million of reductions in addition to not opening the new Beal School as planned was painful enough, and certainly signals to the community what is at stake if we do not get the funding that we need to maintain the resources that we have. At this point, I want to turn it over to Mr. Collins to go over a few more specifics around kindergarten, and then I'll make a summary statement and then open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. So just to talk a little bit more specifically about kindergarten planning, like lots of things that we're dealing with right now, we have multiple contingency plans, and so we've used this symbolism of a stoplight to talk about kindergarten planning, multiple scenarios. The first one is the so-called green light, the most positive situation, which would be the one that is part and parcel or implicit in Dr. Sawyer's budget recommendation to you right now, which is opening up the new Beal School as planned, and having the resources to do that as part of his budget request. Certainly executing and implementing on the K through 4 redistricting plan that you just voted on this evening. Then that would allow for, the space would allow for a full-day kindergarten for all students, finally. And then at the same time, we'd be permanently eliminating the tuition charge and have tuition-free full-day kindergarten starting this fall with the 21-22 school year. I think it's important to note that, just as a reference point, that last school year, the 1920 school year, that across the Commonwealth, 96.4% of kindergarten students in the Commonwealth were in a full-day kindergarten program. And only 38 out of 316 school districts that were offering kindergarten charged tuition. We're still one of those 38. And so certainly that speaks to the need for opening up fully Beal School and also eliminating as part of your policy decisions previously to eliminate that tuition charge. So that's the so-called green light, best case scenario option. Then we move to red light, which is the worst case scenario, which would mean that we don't have the resources to open up the Beal School as planned, that either there's no operational override on the ballot, or that there is a ballot question and it fails. So the worst case scenario is that it's so bad that we would not even occupy the new Beal School, and we'd remain in the existing facility at 1 Maple Avenue. We would defer the elementary school redistricting plan that was contingent upon opening up the new school, and then we would go back to conducting a lottery for a limited amount of full-day kindergarten seats. And then as a result of that, some students again would receive full-day kindergarten and others would be half-day. And certainly a tuition charge could be considered by the school committee in that case to help offset teacher costs. And if one were considered at an annual tuition amount of $1,200, it's estimated that the tuition yield would be somewhere between $220,000 to $265,000, depending on enrollment and seats available, so that you have that range to understand what that might yield. And then speaking of yield, we move to the yellow part of the stoplight, and this one is another possible outcome which would be first, the assumption that there's no operational override on the ballot, or that there is a ballot question and it fails. But under this circumstance, we do occupy partially the Beal School in a limited fashion, using about 40% or a little bit under 40% of the classrooms for kindergarten and grade 1 students. We would defer our elementary school redistricting plan. And so the new Beal School would act similar way to the current Beal School with kindergarten and some grade 1 students from the Floral District. We could conduct a lottery for a limited amount of full-day kindergarten seats. And then again, a tuition could be considered by the school committee, again, in that range, depending on the seats available and enrollment and interest by parents, somewhere between $220,000 to $265,000. So the difference here is between the yellow and the red is basically occupying the new Beal School in a limited fashion. And so those are our contingency plans for kindergarten for next year at this particular point. And I'll turn it back to Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. So to recap, we have a gap of $4.9 million based on the balanced budget that the town manager needed to submit and versus what our needs are to maintain our program and to open the new Beal School. So that's the scope of what we're dealing with. In terms of how we can solve this problem, we shared this slide with you 2 weeks ago. People, of course, are wondering what's going to happen with more federal stimulus. We know that there's a proposal going through Congress for additional stimulus aid that would include funding for public schools. In terms of, obviously, that will be welcome if we receive funding from that. As far as what it means for us, right now we don't know what it's going to mean. It's out of our control as to what those funds are. The timing certainly does not match our schedule in terms of making plans and making decisions. All the previous money coming from the federal government has been restricted to using it specifically for COVID needs. So it's unlikely that those funds would be able to just plug in reduced amounts of local resources or state resources. And again, it's one-time money. It might spare us for a year. And obviously, anything would be welcome, but it's certainly not going to solve our long-term budget dilemma. The other option that I see as reasonable is that there is an operational override that is within the control certainly of the local government. The Board of Selectmen has the ability and the authority whether to put something on the ballot for voters in Shrewsbury to make a decision about whether to raise their property taxes in order to provide more funding for town government, including the school department. That timeline could better match our budget cycle, and that would also provide recurring revenue that would help go to solving that longer-term funding needs that we have. And obviously, the school committee 2 weeks ago mentioned and certainly has been requesting of the selectmen to do so. And we know that they'll be meeting with the selectmen coming up. I'll refer to that shortly. So that really are the only two options that I can see right now that would be able to fill this gap in a way that helps us meet our students' needs. The timing, again, is really important for us. We know that the timing of actually knowing whether something like an override would be successful is going to be further in the spring. But if we are going to find out soon that there won't be a question, that will obviously push us towards making some decisions sooner. And we have a lot of planning that we have to do for next year around reopening, around the new Beal, all those kinds of things. So timing really is critical for us as well. As far as the timeline ahead, on the 10th, we presented the budget recommendation. This evening, we presented the reduction plan. There is a joint meeting of the selectmen and the school committee this coming Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. It will be virtual, and we will make sure that their link to that is on our website under the news section. We'll push that out to our listserv as well. Then throughout March and April, there'll be further discussion around these things. There's a public hearing we'll hold at our March 10th meeting. And then there's a finance committee meeting on March 27th. And then the annual town meeting has been changed to Saturday on May 22nd. That is when ultimately the town's legislative body, the town meeting members, will vote on the appropriated budget for all town departments. So that is the timeline ahead. So I will close with just reminding everyone again that we are facing an education emergency. And essentially, that raises the question of what does it cost? What is the cost of an education emergency? Obviously, from the presentation to this evening, you know that the cost in dollars and cents is about $4.9 million to get us where we need to go for next year. But I just want to remind everyone that the cost of not being able to provide these funds is going to affect what our students receive from us. This has always been one of my favorite photos on our website because I think it just captures the joy of the accomplishment that these students had just after having graduated from Shrewsbury High School. When I think about what those students look like from the time they enter Parker Road Preschool, through our elementary schools, our middle schools, and our high school, this town has been rightfully proud of what we provide to our students. And this is not a community that should be in a position thinking about closing elementary libraries, putting 30 students in a class, reducing the number of courses kids can take in high school because we don't have enough money. That is not the kind of community we are. It's not the kind of community we should be. So in summary this evening, I just want to share with you that I personally do not believe that our community is going to allow our town's children to suffer the consequences of making these kinds of devastating cuts to our schools. Shrewsbury is a community that values the education of its children. I came to this community more than 2 decades ago to be part of an extraordinary school district, and it has been the privilege of my professional career to serve this community and to see what the educators and support staff and families do in this community to help students be successful. There are extraordinary things that have happened all the time. There are so many ways in which the community signals its value of educating our students well. And I do believe, having been here not only as an educator, but as a resident and raising my family here, I believe that our community is going to respond to this emergency by providing the resources our educators need to provide what our students need. I can't imagine that we will not do that as a community. But over the next couple of months, we are going to be in a position where we have to plan that this will be the case, that people will step up and do what we need to have happen to serve our kids well, or we are going to have to do some things that are going to end up dismantling this wonderful school district that we've built, which will be something that will create great distress that will take a very long time to recover from at the absolute worst possible time when we're trying to be recovering from the greatest crisis we've faced educationally in most of our lifetimes. So with that, I'm sorry to have to deliver this kind of recommendation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee has.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Questions, comments from the committee? We'll start with Lindsay.
I have so many feelings right now, so let me start with a couple pointed questions, and then I have some comments if that's okay. I am feeling fairly sick to my stomach. Do we know, Dr. Sawyer, I understand the class size issues are certainly paramount as we think about all of these cuts. I understand that cuts, particularly, I think if I understand correctly, at the middle school level, as we look at programs like Allied Arts, that those are structured differently than your 4 core teachers. And is my understanding correct that Allied Arts, in addition to having the core subjects be class sizes where there will certainly be some kids in rooms over 30, that would be true in those as well? And is that at the same rate, or is it more severe at that point?
Well, it really depends class to class and the way the schedule breaks out, but, typically, just because of the way that the schedule is structured, oftentimes Allied Arts classes will have slightly higher class sizes, sometimes even significantly higher class sizes than the team classes have. Again, depending on our resources that particular year for personnel, how many students might be choosing to take a certain foreign language, and that creates it's a very complex schedule that works at the middle school. So there's really 2 things. If we raise class sizes in our middle schools to 27s and 28s, assuredly we're going to have plenty of sections in the Allied Arts that are over 30. And then additionally, part of this reduction plan has an unspecified 3.5 additional FTE to be reduced somewhere in the Allied Arts specialist area. That could be shaving off some FTE from different positions across the K-8 span, but it could also put additional pressure on class size for Allied Arts at middle school as well.
Thank you. Second, do we know, I'm thinking about the, red, yellow, green. Do we have an understanding of what impacts we have as a community for not opening Beal School in terms of dollars? This predated my being on the committee, but my understanding is the Mass School Building Authority, we have an agreement with them as a community, obviously not our agreement, but to build, open, and run Beal School. Do we have a sense about, and I open that up to anybody, about what the impacts are of the $30 million that have been plus million from the state? Or what our plan is on that?
You're talking about the financial agreement that we have with the
Yes.
MSBA? Well, we do have, it is a financial agreement, it's an educational agreement as well that we have with the MSBA. So we have had a call with the MSBA to let them know that that is a concern of ours, being able to financially open the school upon completion of construction. They have taken that under advisement, and they have let us know that they will be setting up a second call with us. So that is all we know as of today.
Okay. And my third question is, Mr. Collins, I believe in some of the slides that you shared about per pupil expenditures, that you were comparing the Shrewsbury's per pupil expenditures for sort of an all-in per pupil expenditure versus an in-district. And which gets us to about the 11th percentile range. And when I pulled DESE's most recent publicly available information, and we look purely at in-district expenditures, right? What the community of Shrewsbury puts towards the students versus adding in state dollars and other places that we pull from. And I will double check my math for the community, but I believe we're in the 8th percentile as a community in terms of what we, the town, and our taxpayers put towards our students. So I guess as I turn over to my comments, I'm frankly livid that this is the place that we are in, and not at anyone in this room, but that we are at the place that amid a pandemic, when I know my children are suffering educationally, and I know that other children and other parents in this community are greatly worried about where we stand, that this is where we are, and that frankly we have gone as a community from a place of being willing to put a capital expenditure before the voters without a plan to fund it, and to fund the ongoing operational cost to put teachers in the building. It's madness, and I would not want anyone to think that this is a one-year problem. But the problem that we need the community to address is the ongoing structural deficit. For us to figure out how to cobble together a plan to, as it was said, to dismantle our educational system. I think about the 80 plus teachers that we're talking about that we had planned for, that we will no longer be able to have, in addition to the 28 that we cut this year. So we're now up to almost 110 professionals that we're removing from our educational system in just a 2-year cycle. I want to be optimistic with you, Dr. Sawyer, that the community is going to come together. Right now, I am very worried. I am very worried, and my hands are shaking. I'm so mad that this is where we are, because how do you not have media in elementary school? How is this possibly a place where we are? I mean, it's frankly ludicrous. And every single place you were given an impossible task. So this is not a affront to the district to figure out how to close a gap, because that's what we're going to have to do. And I'm not in a place to suggest any changes that should be made there. But to get class sizes this high, to cut on special ed where we know those will come back to bite us, right? When we don't handle our special education mandates well and with all attention to detail, we will have problems. So I guess I'll just stop there. I'm upset, and the fact that we even have to consider, not only the not opening Beal, but that we continue to be in the course of the 0.6% of kindergartners in the state who don't have access to full-day kindergarten, all of it. we're looking at a disaster, and an emergency is not an understatement, Dr. Sawyer, at all.
Thank you. Anyone else? Go ahead, Dale.
I'll make a couple of points here. First of all, just simply put, we need an override this spring. And there are no ifs, ands, or buts about that. We should never, as a town, allow the services that we provide to deteriorate. If the town government allows the services that they provide to deteriorate, that's a failure of town government. And so we need to understand this from that simple point of view. We need to have our town government meet its responsibility to the citizens. And so we need an override this spring to prevent what we just saw predicted here from happening. Right now, the next step on this trip is to have the selectmen put an override before the voters. And there is just nothing on their agenda that is more important than this. There is nothing on their agenda that is more urgent than this. And this is something which they have got to address and they have got to put out there for the voters. Let the voters decide. There's no reason to delay this any further. The purpose, we are in this bind, the term structural deficit, because of the Proposition 2.5, which was put out there to involve the voters in decisions regarding funding town government. That was the purpose of Proposition 2.5. When it was enacted in the early 1980s, town government was felt to be out of control. There was high unemployment. There was very high inflation of 10% or more. And putting 2.5% out there was intended to starve the local governments and force the electorate into looking at these budgets. Having an override to fund the government is part of the design. It is not a sign of failure. It is part of the design. The town of Shrewsbury has enjoyed a free ride off of the growth that it has enjoyed over the past 50 or so years. So many houses have been built that the property tax revenues have increased to the point where typically in the past, the revenues have not gone up by 2.5%, but they've gone up by 4 or more %. And so we have cruised because of that. We've rounded that bend, and the growth in property tax revenues is not sustaining that 4% amount. And so we then have to confront the idea that we are running a town government that requires about 4%. We're running a school system that requires about 4%. And we have revenues that are not 4%. And so being able to periodically have an override is a reasonable thing. And it is what other communities have done much more often than we have. In the years since the early 1980s, when Proposition 2.5 passed, there have been over 4,000 overrides in the state of Massachusetts put to a vote. And so and roughly half of them have passed, so 2,000. Shrewsbury has had one override vote pass. So it is not unusual. Other communities confront this routinely. It is not considered to be a catastrophe. It is not considered to be a sign of failure of government. It is a recognition of the fact that you need to make your revenues match the level of services that you expect. We need an override this spring. The last point I want to make is that, if we look around at people who've had their vaccines, and if they're still wearing a mask, they're still being advised to keep 6 feet away from their other people. And the research regarding COVID is evolving as we go through this pandemic. We don't know everything we need to know. There's still caution regarding the infectivity of people who've had a vaccine. And so I have high hopes for everybody who needs a vaccine getting one by next September, and maybe they will. But I don't know that we can necessarily say, great, throw away your masks, cuddle up to the person next to you, it's back to the old days. And so if we are in a situation where on the one hand we are confronted with asking students or requiring students to be closer and not knowing what the guidance is going to be then, we could be in even more trouble than this scenario predicts, because we don't know what's coming next with regard to this, and it bears repeating that we have to confront this and make sure that we protect the students and the schools. Thank you.
Jason?
Looking at the suite of potential cuts that the superintendent has outlined for us tonight, I have many thoughts like my colleagues, and the first of which is that this is unacceptable. And that is not a comment directed at the superintendent or his team, who have gone above and beyond in trying to make this impossible situation somehow possible. This is unacceptable as a Shrewsbury resident and as a product of Shrewsbury Public Schools, who has and has always taken great pride in my community. We have, over the past few weeks, leapt from the notion that a $100 million new school building on Lake Street will not be utilized for its intended purposes because we can't find the $1.7 million necessary to fill it with teachers, to a situation where we might not have media centers functioning in a post-pandemic world. And I just want to drive that home. A lot of things are closed during the pandemic. We're not talking about pandemic situations. We're talking about a post-pandemic world where our media centers and our elementary schools become physical shells for a decimated purpose. We need substantial new revenues. I recognize that the municipal side of town government is strained as well. That is a reality that this town confronts, and Shrewsbury Public Schools is not the only municipal department dealing with constraints and cuts. To me, that does not signal that everybody needs to just cool their jets. To me, that signals that this community needs additional revenues, and the only vehicle available to derive those revenues in a sufficient amount is through the vehicle of an operational override. To the point that Dr. McGee made very eloquently, and I won't belabor the point, an operational override is not a sign of failure. 2.5% is not a figure that was derived at by professionals or academics representing some appropriate level of growth. It is a political number derived as part of a ballot campaign in 1980 that was designed to starve some municipal governments and for others just to make sure that the voters of a community were in sync with what municipal government was trying to do. And I believe that the quality of Shrewsbury Public Schools in the past, I would say the past 20 years, 30 years, has really more accurately reflected what Shrewsbury wants of its schools than what it is we have on offer for the coming year or years. It's time for this community to be consulted. In 2014, this community passed an operational override. That was a very inspirational effort. I am sorry to say that to get there, we had to let real harm come to our educational program in terms of inappropriately large class sizes, damage to student outcomes. I don't think we should get to the point where we're putting our students through real tangible harm. Our students are going through real tangible harm as a result of COVID-19. That's already happened this year. We can't do a buffer year where we just really need the community to see how bad things are before we put this question to them. We've just gone through a bad year. I can, in good conscience, go along with piling a second one onto that. The other thing I'll say about 2014 is in 2014, both Shrewsbury and our neighboring community of Grafton passed operational overrides for similar reasons. And both communities were very upfront, very forward-looking, thoughtful municipal leadership saying this is going to be okay for about 5 years. It's not a permanent solution to everything. It's going to be okay for about 5 years. Well, at the 6-year mark, Grafton did another one, and we're now staring the 7-year mark in the face. The time has come for us to do the same. From an investment perspective, this is the right thing to do. This is a community of a lot of homeowners. I own a nearly 200-year-old house myself that's constantly giving me headaches. If your roof needs to be fixed, it is an expensive and unpleasant proposition, but if you ignore it
It's more expensive.
for a period of time, I can guarantee you that the fix will become more catastrophic, more expensive, and more disruptive to your life in every imaginable way. So from an investment standpoint, the sooner we deal with this crisis, the better the outcome is going to be for our students and for our community. But beyond simply an investment standpoint, there's a quality of life question. For those who don't know, my service on the school committee is very personal for me. I'm a product of Shrewsbury Public Schools. I am where I am in life because of the experiences I received in Shrewsbury Public Schools. That's why I'm here. Degrading the educational experience degrades outcomes for our students. It degrades quality of life for families. It degrades pride in our community. We need to avoid that degradation. This body is full of people, obviously, who are pretty unanimous in our very strong feelings. We have not the authority to take the steps that are necessary to solve this from a revenue standpoint. I speak now to those who do, who are people who are equally dedicated to this community, who are homeowners and have families in this community, and who, some of whom grew up here and are people who have really dedicated a substantial portion of their time and lives to improving and maintaining the quality of life here. And I know that those are thoughtful people who knew that at some point we were going to cross this Rubicon and have been thoughtful in their assessment of when we're going to be at that river's banks. I suggest to them to look down because the water is rushing over their feet. Thank you.
John?
Yeah, so I think, there seems to be, there's a lot of hesitancy when you talk about operational overrides. I know over the years that I've been on this board, it's become kind of, override is become kind of a four-letter word. You're almost afraid to say it in some cases. But I think after what you've heard tonight, I don't know that any one person can look at the operational override as a lot of work, or maybe that people won't go for it, because the result of doing nothing is 48 staff reductions, is increasing class sizes to upwards of 30 per class in some elementary and middle school classes. And I know from the outside looking in as a parent back in 2014, class sizes was a grave concern of mine, as a parent. And that's what motivated me to want to get more involved. And, here I am, right? I don't know what it will take to even allow us to ask that question on the ballot. There's still some hesitancy around it amidst all of the data and all of the information that this administration has provided, over the months and the weeks leading to this point. And my concern is around the ramifications that come with an announcement like this, and we've seen it in previous years when reduction plans are announced. And I said it in our last meeting, I worry about office morale. I think, Dr. Sawyer had to, explain to staff that this announcement was coming tonight. And, at risk is the valuable resources that we depend on today, right? And that starts tomorrow, right? When it comes to, educators looking, at, is it worth the risk to my livelihood for this instability, this recurring instability that we see year after year? It just doesn't seem to end. Last year, we had to reduce 30, and now we face the prospect of another 48. Where does it end? I've seen this happen in previous years. When my daughter was at Patton School, we had to announce a reduction plan, and one of her favorite music teachers actually left early because she was afraid. She was afraid of losing her job, and that is a sad reality in this case. In addition to that, we pride ourselves in this district for attracting top talent because we're a high-performing district. But again, this is a recurring cycle of, underfunding that we're just not able to get there. We've seen since 2014's override just chipping away at the gains that we had. So I worry about those two things after this announcement. What happens in those cases? And again, why are we in this position? I think it's just a failure to have the will to ask that question. Let the voters decide. We know what the worst case scenario is. They could say no, but what if they were to say yes? We won't know unless we ask the question. And I think, from my perspective, Plan A is to ask the override question and hope that it passes. Right? But if we're not allowed to ask that question, and if it doesn't pass, what you've heard tonight is Plan B. So.
Thank you, John. As we were talking about this, I was thinking it was 15 or 16 years ago. I was in my office at work, and somebody who lived in the community came in and said, I'm having people at my house tonight. We're really worried about what's happening. But most of us were on school councils, and, we're seeing this issues with the budget. And that started this group, which ended up going into that first override in '07 that failed. And I wasn't on the school committee then, but this conversation as I'm sitting here. It's the same tired, old conversation of this budget issue that we continually deal with. and the structural deficit. And it's not, it's not an expense issue, it's a revenue problem and that we're continually dealing with. And, the town manager does the best that he can to help, but we have expenses that continue to rise, and we need to really do something about it. And I do have a large concern, and John touched upon it a little, with attracting and retaining staff, because the budget issue that we're facing in Shrewsbury is not it's not happening in other districts, even with COVID. Like, we are having an issue that Shrewsbury is facing continually. So if this continues, are we going to be that district that gets more applications than we need? Ms. Malone would always have hundreds of applications for one. And I think that this may be something that we're going to start to grapple with. So there's lots of concerns with this. And I think there's two pieces to this. We've got the structural deficit. The school department's been adapting and managing and always dealing with it. We've raised fees to some of the highest in the state. We've brought in that type of revenue. We are reducing and, being efficient where we can, but we're at that point where we can't continue. So we need to deal with this current budget piece right now, but we need to start talking about long-term planning. How do we, as a community, deal with the structural deficit? And I know the school committee has publicly asked for these types of discussions with the boards in town. And we are meeting with the Board of Selectmen on the 2nd, and Dr. Sori mentioned this is a televised meeting. I think it will be a good discussion for the community to hear as the boards meet. I know we are going to ask the Finance Committee if they want to have a Q&A with us to talk about their reduction plan, talk about our budget, so that they can have real-time information from us as well. It is frustrating, and again, it's just a tiring negative cycle that we're continuing to have. I personally agree. There's no other option other than an override right now. The plan B is this reduction plan, and I just think that brings us back to 2014 or before with class sizes, and we're not adding to the program. So it is not a good news story. It's something that we will be working with the Board of Selectmen, hopefully to come to some type of a decision so that we can move forward, and we will be keeping the community as informed as we can. And we ask them to continue to, we've been getting emails to let us know what your opinions are, your suggestions. We're open to that continually, so thank you. Anything further, Dr. Sawyer?
I appreciate the commentary from the committee. I share the same concern about our staff's morale. A year that's already been extraordinarily difficult, to layer this on top is really something that our staff should not have to be dealing with, but we do. It is my hope that they're going to see the energy from this community coming forward around providing what they need, and that will not result in people looking for other places where that might be more financially stable. We've tried to make this a district where it's people who are education professionals can practice in a way that they can innovate and really get fulfillment from doing the best they can to help kids succeed. And people obviously want to be helpful to students, but no one wants to be in a professional situation where their ability to do that is compromised by lack of resources. Whether those are lack of the things that we need as far as tools, but also just having overwhelming numbers of cases or students, or not having the amount of support that they should have. So it certainly pains me to think about the possibilities here, but again, I will reiterate that I really don't see our community allowing this to happen to our students and to our schools.
Thank you. Okay, next we have our minutes from our meeting held on February 10th, 2021. Are there any changes or corrections? Seeing none, those can be marked as accepted as distributed. We do need to go into executive session this evening for the purpose of addressing Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A7, to comply with or act under the authority of any general or special law or federal grant and aid requirements. Purpose 7, open meeting law, Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 22FG, for the purpose of reviewing, approving, and/or releasing executive session minutes. B, for the purpose of addressing Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A3, to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining or litigation. If an open meeting may have a detrimental effect of the bargaining or litigating position of the public body, and the chair so declares. Purpose 3, the Shrewsbury Education Association Units A and/or B, the Shrewsbury Paraprofessional Association and/or the Cafeteria Workers Association. We have a motion that we adjourn to executive session.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call vote is required. Ms. Heffernan?
Aye.
Mr. Palich?
Aye.
Dr. McGee?
Aye.
Mr. Wensky?
Aye.
Myself, aye. Thank you and good night.